Okay, apologies for that. That abrupt break was a result of my iPad, on which I'm filming these cinematic masterpieces, maxing out on its memory. So in the past few minutes, I've been frantically and ruthlessly disposing of apps and photo memories, which I will now have to live without. And I'm pleased to say that I've managed to recover enough data so that I can continue to record these lectures without them breaking, or at least this is what it looks like to me. I think I have now sufficient megabytes to carry on. Okay, so apologies for that. We got as far as the Communist Party in Yugoslavia, and I was explaining that in the interwar period, initially it had started strongly, but then it had been forced underground into a sort of status of illegality in the 1920s and the 1930s, and this resulted in a sort of all of the things that I mentioned in the lecture on Stalinization. That the membership was now much more, if you like, Leninist, much more, like professional revolutionaries, full-time revolutionaries. Many of them had been incarcerated in the in the dictatorship's jails under Alexander Karadziorjevich's dictatorship. Many of them had been tortured. Many of them were very habituated to moving around in small cells, moving around in clandestine cells, and sort of avoiding capture. So just like elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, this was a very useful skill to have going forwards. Now, from the late 1930s onwards, let's turn to slide 10 and meet someone who we're going to be meeting much more of and hearing much more of in the coming weeks. In this process of illegality, the party had sort of hit a lot of problems and had become in many ways quite divided and quite disorganized. But this changed in the second half of the 1930s, and it changed because of the very capable and the very ruthless leadership of the general secretary of the party, I think from 1937 onwards, a man called Josip Broz, who is known to history from his Comintern, his Communist International alias Tito. Now, Tito would emerge in the 1930s as the most important and the most prominent Yugoslav communist, and of course he would go on at the end of the Second World War to become the president of the state, the head of the Yugoslav communist state, and he would remain its most dominant force, undoubtedly his most dominant force, right up until his death in May 1980. So it's worth spending a few moments just talking a little bit about Tito, who he was, what he was like, where he came from. So Tito was born, Josip Broz, at the end of the 19th century on the border between Slovenia and Croatia, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, or Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Tito had grown up in a village. He had grown up with 15 brothers and sisters, not all of whom survived out of infancy. He lived in grinding poverty. He lived in terrible conditions, and infant mortality and these sorts of things, and illness were very common. And as a young man, Tito took an apprenticeship as a locksmith. He travelled around the monarchy, travelled to away from his village to Vienna, worked as an apprentice there. At the beginning of the First World War, he was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army. He served on the Balkan front against the Serbs, something which was covered up right up until the 1960s. He also served on the Eastern Front. He fought against the Russian Empire, and he was captured by the Russians in 1916. So He was in Russia in 1916, and he became an incidental witness to the Russian revolutions, the February Revolution, and then the Bolsheviks' revolution in October 1917. And this made a profound mark on Tito. He saw the workers and soldiers, not unlike himself, and not people who didn't have different backgrounds to him, were involved in this incredible radical transformation of Russia, that they transformed the autocratic empire of the Romanov dynasty into this left wing revolutionary state, this Bolshevik state, and he was very impressed with what had happened. And this was true, in fact, of very many people, many prisoners of war who had been captured in Russia. Had been part of the Austro-Hungarian army, like Tito, had witnessed the revolution in Russia, and had eventually trickled back into Central and Eastern Europe, but with new sort of radical ideas. And Tito was somebody like this. He also came back with a wife. He met a Russian woman, which is also not unusual for those men being lonely and far from home. He met a Russian woman. He married her. They had a son. But I think he abandoned her quite early on, and then came back to Croatia, came back to what was then Yugoslavia, once again as essentially a single man. So in the 1920s, he rose up through the trades union movement, which was a front, of course, for the Communist Party. And he became one of the most charismatic young figures in the Yugoslav Communist Party. He was put on trial in 1929, and that trial became a great sensation. Tito had been on hunger strike for 4 or 5 days before the trial. He acquitted himself in this incredibly sort of dramatic way, told the judge that he didn't recognize communist law, recognized the law of the interwar kingdom, only recognized communist law. This case became a huge sort of, a huge sensation in the press, and Tito became something of a celebrity in the Yugoslav communist movement in the 1930s. He was, of course, sent to prison, but the prisons in Yugoslavia were very much like radical universities. There were a lot of communists in them, and they were holding classes, and they were talking about Marx, and they were talking about Lenin, and they were talking about revolution. So Tito got a great training in the interwar period. Now, in the second half of the 1930s, he went to Russia, went to the Soviet Union, was in Russia at the time of the Great Terror, miraculously survived. Nobody to this day really knows how he did this, what compromises, what agreements he made. My theory, and it is just a theory, is that Tito cultivated very good links with the NKVD, with the Soviet security police, and this is essentially how he managed to survive when very many foreign communists within Moscow, of course, did not survive. They were either executed by the NKVD or they were sent into the Gulag, the prison camp system, and indeed many Yugoslav communists were, including the previous general secretary, from whom Tito took over at the end of the 1930s. So Tito was a survivor, definitely, and we'll see that time and time again. He is a man who appears to have 9 lives. He didn't die in the First World War. He didn't die in the Great Terror. He won't now die in the Yugoslav Civil War, and he is not killed, despite the strenuous efforts by Stalin once the country splits with the Soviet Union in 1948. So throughout his career, this is a man who is able to sort of get through very tough situations. He's able to sort of somehow, at times seemingly miraculously, survive very difficult situations. So anyway, to come back to the Civil War, that's Tito's background. Now, in 1941, when the country is attacked and when the country is invaded, Tito is now the dominant figure within the Yugoslav Communist Party, within the Yugoslav Communist movement. He's the general secretary. He's essentially, not seriously, his prominence within the movement is not seriously contested. He is now the most powerful figure within Yugoslav communism. Now, once the war begins, with all of these things that are happening, with the Axis occupation, with the Ustasha, with the Chetniks, with the chaos in Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav Communist Party also launches a guerrilla warfare, a guerrilla insurgency. And the aim of this guerrilla insurgency is, of course, to defeat not just the Axis occupiers, but also ultimately these other forces within the country. So to beat the Ustasha, to beat the Chetniks, and to emerge as the dominant force within Yugoslavia. Now, this is precisely what happens. It's what they manage to do. From 1941 until 1945, there is an incredible military drama in which the Communist Party and its army, the partisan army, move around the country, move through the mountains, several times almost obliterated by the Axis, almost obliterated by the Chetniks, but somehow, despite incredible losses, always managed to sort of pull through and always managed to survive. And again, Tito, who becomes a man with a huge bounty on his head, manages also to survive this very perilous period. Now, the story of this survival is a very complicated one, it is fascinating and it is dramatic. And if anybody is interested, I can recommend books and I can even recommend movies that were made in the 1960s and the 70s, big war epics. In which Tito was played by Richard Burton. The great Orson Welles plays a Chetnik commander. Your usual suspects of the great German character actors play various Wehrmacht bad guys. It's an incredible war drama, an incredible epic. But ultimately, the communists managed to survive. They managed to keep their military intact. They managed to keep their partisan army intact, and they managed to keep the Politburo, so the political nerve center of the communist movement, intact. Now, again, I don't want to go into detail, but there are incredible battles, and one of the most sort of nerve-wracking ones comes in 1943, when the Germans decide they've had enough of the communists, they want to get rid of them. They make a deal with the Ustasha and even with the Chetniks that they will destroy the entirety of the communist movement. There's an incredible sort of drama in which Tito moves along a river in Bosnia called the Neretva, moves up, moves down, and eventually somehow manages to pontoon the bridge, get across it, destroy the Chetniks, and evade, narrowly capture. About 90% of the communist movement is wiped out, but Tito survives, the military high command survive, and the Politburo, most of the Politburo survive as well. And that's enough to keep going, essentially. So it's an incredible story, and one that is worth knowing, and one that is interested in, one that is certainly very interesting to know. But basically, militarily, the communists are able to successfully survive at least this kind of civil war. They're able to sort of survive the Ustasha. They're able to survive the Chetnik attacks, and they're able to survive the attacks from the Axis powers, from the Italians, the occupying Italians, and the occupying Germans. Now, that's one reason for their success. Another reason for the partisans' success, another reason for Tito's success, is the following one. Unlike the Ustasha and unlike the Chetniks, Tito has a vision, a political, ideological vision for the future of Yugoslavia. The communist movement understands in typical communist fashion that in order to win over support for the people, it's necessary not just to win the military battle, but also to win the hearts and the minds of the people. And that is done by explaining through their commissars, through their educational bureau, through their political officers, to the people in villages in Bosnia, in villages in Croatia, in villages in Serbia, what the future means, what a communist victory will entail. And very often they're coming into these villages and they're saying things like, look, the Ustasha have blown it. They're just simply a bunch of genocidal, of course the word didn't exist at the time, homicidal maniacs. They're killing everyone. They're killing Jews. They're killing non-Croats. They're killing non-Ustasha. They're not the future. And the Chetniks are the same. They're just killing anyone who doesn't agree with them and doesn't look like them. If you join our movement, we promise an end to the killing, but also an end to the tyranny. And, they would talk about the failures of the interwar period as well. They would talk about the dictatorship. They would talk about the economic hardships that people went through. All of these things resonated very powerfully with people in Yugoslavia, people in dismembered Yugoslavia, people in war-torn Yugoslavia. So the communists were able not only to sort of successfully wage a military conflict, but also to offer a reasonable, valid sort of political vision for the future of the country. Now, again, it comes back to these questions that I mentioned, these points that I made a couple of weeks ago. We talked about Czechoslovakia. And I talked about how at the end of the Second World War, a majority of people at the electorate voted for the Communist Party. A vast majority of people did so. And they did so because of the disappointments of the interwar period, because of the suffering that they had undergone during the Second World War under occupation, because of the disappointments of the Western powers, all of these things. The same kind of popular support, at least initially, existed for the communists within Yugoslavia. And it was because the communists were able to communicate to many people a better vision of the future, a vision in which economic hardship would go, and a vision in which exploitation would disappear, in which a certain kind of dictatorship would disappear, although of course it would be replaced with a different kind of dictatorship. Unlike the Chetniks and unlike the Ustasha, the communists really had a sort of thoroughgoing vision for the future of the country, and it was a pan-Yugoslav vision. It was a vision which incorporated all of the South Slav peoples, not just the Croats, not just the Serbs, not just the Slovenes. On this point, at least, the communist sort of notion that national identity was bourgeois, that there would be a more evolved sort of ideology coming under communism, worked in their favor, because they were sort of saying, yes, Yugoslavia will come back, but it will come back ruled by the Communist Party, ruled by the communists, and it will be vastly superior to what we have had up until this point. Now, this vision of a political future was laid out in a very famous session in a Bosnian town, a very beautiful Ottoman town called Jajce, which is in central Bosnia, and the meeting took place on the 29th of November 1943. This was a political meeting in which the communists sat down with their democratic allies. It was becoming increasingly clear that they were winning the civil war, that the Ustasha were falling to pieces, that the Chetniks were also a busted flush, and that the Yugoslav partisans, the Communist Party, were increasingly likely to win this conflict. So they sat down and they thrashed out in some detail what the future would look like, what the country would look like after the war was over. This is the very famous, it's known in Yugoslav history as the Second Anti-Fascist Council, or the Avnoj meeting, as I say, in Jajce in Bosnia on the 29th of November 1943. Now, the details I've put down in this hyperlink, and you can look at that, and that's quite a valuable and useful source. The details of the agreements that were thrashed out at this meeting, but I'll simply restrict it to one, and this detail is extremely important. The Yugoslavs decided that when the state was reformed at the end of the Second World War, it would be one single Yugoslav state, but it would be divided into 6 federal republics. And those republics were Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Serbia. And you can see them on the map there. Now, the precedent for this division had come from the Soviet Union itself. Many of you will know that the Soviet Union was one communist state ruled by the Soviet Communist Party, but nevertheless divided into 15 Soviet socialist republics. Back in the day, they were Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, and Georgia. I don't think I forgot any. I think that's all of them. Yes, I think that is all of them. Anyway, it was the same in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav Communist Party would rule the entire country, but the country nevertheless would be subdivided into these six republics. Now, there are various reasons for this. Tito was still attempting to make sure he had support across the country, and he knew that these were concessions that would be very popular regionally. So, explaining that there would be a Macedonian republic or a Slovenian republic would keep support for the Yugoslav communists in those reaches, amongst the Slovenes, amongst the Macedonians, amongst the Montenegrins, amongst the Bosnians, and so on and so forth. So this was one reason. Another reason is that he believed, and the communists believed, that the political failures of the interwar period could be attributed to the, as I mentioned earlier, the dominance of the Serbs within the country, and a lot of people felt that under the Karađorđević dynasty, the Serbs had simply been too powerful, and this was unfair to the rest of the people. So the federalization, the vision of Yugoslavia, which would be six republics within the control of an overarching Yugoslav Communist Party, became a means of sort of shoring up support for the conflict and for the future state amongst all Yugoslav peoples. Now, the reason that this is very important is one that we will come back to later on in the module. Those republican divisions, those republic borders, would ultimately become the blueprint for the successor states during the 1990s, when Yugoslavia disintegrated once again in civil war. The new independent nation states, just as they did in the 1990s in ex-Soviet Union, would become the sort of the groundwork for the independent states of Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, and so on. So the Yaitsa Declaration and the Yaitsa meeting, the council meeting on the 29th of November 1943, is the critical turning point in the 20th century history of Yugoslavia. Okay, now ultimately, let me wrap up. This has been an extremely detailed discussion, so let me try to sort of streamline a little bit going forwards. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking for another hour. And I'm sorry to say that when I do start talking about Yugoslavia, I do tend to sort of I do tend to go on a lot, because it's sort of it is what I've been working on for many years. Now, eventually Tito won with the civil war, beat the Ustasha, arrested their leaders. Pavlic fled and was eventually killed in the 1950s by a communist assassin. Captured Mihailovic, executed him in 1946 after a show trial, and emerged the leader, the ruler of this new Yugoslav state. Undoubtedly the ruler, and this was confirmed in a referendum in 1946. So the Communist Party had won, but the communist revolution in Yugoslavia, as I mentioned earlier, was unlike the communist revolutions in places like Poland or Hungary or Romania or some of the other countries we've been talking about in previous sessions. It was not a political seizure of power. It was not something that the Red Army orchestrated. The Red Army had played only a minimal role in the liberation of Yugoslavia. They liberated certain territories in the north of Serbia, and then they immediately moved on into Hungary and into Germany and into the places that were more problematic. They didn't need much support. The Yugoslav partisans, they had their own military force. Now, because of this, the Yugoslav Communist Party was extremely powerful, and it is, I would say, a mass movement. It had, not everywhere, but it had significant support amongst pretty much all of the peoples in what was now a reconstituted Yugoslavia. People had suffered under Ustasha, under the occupation, even under the Chetniks. The political vision, along with the military success of the Yugoslav partisans, had achieved a sort of massive popular support within the country. Now, what this meant, what this created, was a strange paradox in the early communist period, in the early period of the Cold War. You would think that a man like Stalin, looking for control in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, looking for reliable allies, looking for people who are of the same ideology and the same belief system as him, would be pleased that with the fact that there had been this mass communist revolution, this national insurgency, this national liberation movement down in the Balkans, down in Yugoslavia. And initially, Stalin was. He looked on Tito as his most faithful lieutenant, his most loyal lieutenant, potentially a hatchet man if other communist parties stood out of line. And Tito was very willing to play the role of the apt pupil. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Stalinist at this time, as almost all communists were. He believed that his movement was very close to the Soviet Union, the first amongst equals. Amongst Soviet, in the Soviet sphere, and he was therefore, he therefore believed that the relations between the Soviet Union and the newly communist Yugoslavia would be very good indeed. Now, this led to a mistake on the part of Tito, a miscalculation. Ultimately, what Stalin was interested in was a balance of power. Stalin was coming out of the war, as I mentioned in the last session, with 20 to 25 million Soviet citizens dead. He could see the rifts were growing with the Americans and the British. He didn't want to go immediately back into some kind of military conflict. He didn't want to rock the boat with the Western powers. So it meant, for example, that even though there were very strong communist movements in places like Italy, in places like France, in places like Belgium, Stalin demurred from supporting the communist revolution in those parts. He believed that if he did, that if he encouraged, for example, the French communists to seize power in Paris, this would be unacceptable to the Americans, unacceptable to the British, which of course it would. So Stalin didn't want to rock the boat. He wanted to stay within his sphere of influence. And the Allies, to a certain extent, didn't want to upset Stalin either. They were willing to sacrifice countries like Poland, countries like the Baltic states, countries like Hungary and Romania. Those could go in the direction of the Soviet bloc. Those could go under the power, under the control of Stalin, under the control of communist states, so long as Western Europe remained out of the Soviet sphere of influence. Now, Tito didn't understand this. Coming on the back of this incredible revolution, this military victory that his partisans had achieved in the Yugoslav civil war, Tito believed that this was the beginning of a new revolutionary phase within the communist movement, that this was a moment to keep the momentum, to keep moving forward, and to keep sort of promoting the revolutionary line. This was one thing. The second thing that Tito believed is that he thought that his prestige as a military leader and his prestige as the leader of this mass communist insurgency, which had been successful in Yugoslavia, now entitled him to become a powerful regional player. That it was up to him to say what happened in places like Bulgaria, what happened in places like Albania, what happened in places like Greece. So from 1945 until 1948, Tito starts to make a series of very ambitious foreign policy moves which speak to his sort of desire to become a regional Balkan communist strongman. So I'm talking about things like intervening in the civil war in Greece. There was a war between the communists and the royalist forces. Now, Churchill had expressly, in his Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, expressly mentioned Greece and said that it must not become a communist state. And Stalin was willing to accept that, and therefore he was willing to abandon the Greek communists Tito apparently had not got the message. He had not got the memo. He was sending guns down. He was sending some of his best commanders down into the region, people who had fought in the partisan war. He was promoting the communist cause, and this irked Stalin no end. Stalin looked at the Balkans and he thought, my God, this upstart Tito is really going to ruin my relations with Churchill, going to ruin my relations with Truman, going to set off a third world war, even before the second one is barely finished. So this was also, this was also a problem. The Yugoslavs also had designs on Albania. You can see in the map there. We're on slide number 13. Albania, just to the south of Yugoslavia, a much smaller country, one that we'll be talking about in the second session. Tito also believed that it was now his right to occupy and incorporate, to essentially to annex Albania into an expanded Yugoslav state. He had got mixed messages from Stalin, but essentially Stalin saw this and saw these aggressive moves as another reason why Tito's pretensions needed to be checked. Now, the breaking point came in 1947. If we turn to slide number 14, Tito met in a place called Lake Bled, which is in Slovenia, today's Slovenia. Tito had a villa there, and Tito's villa is still there, and it's quite luxurious and quite. I visited. I've never sort of stayed there, but it's you can visit this place. Tito had villas across the entire country, of course, some of which he'd never even stayed in, for God's sakes. He was like a Habsburg prince, basically. Anyway, in 1947, Tito met with the Bulgarian communist leader, who was now a man called Gheorghe Dimitrov. And Dimitrov is somebody that we've met before as the head of the Comintern, as the star of the Leipzig Reichstag fire trial back in 1933. So Tito met with him, and they signed an agreement on greater economic and political cooperation, which, in Tito's view, would be the first step towards transforming Bulgaria into the Seventh Republic of Yugoslavia. And the Bulgarians are South Slavs. They speak a different language. God knows. I'm currently learning it. Currently having classes in Bulgarian. So I know. Speaking Serbian, I know that these two are different languages. But nevertheless, they were South Slavs, and Tito envisaged that the two countries maybe would be joined within a few years' time, and they signed this agreement in 1947. Now this sent Stalin through the roof. He was now, he believed, clear that Tito was not going to be a subordinate, obedient communist leader of a communist satellite state in the mold of the Polish Communist Party or the Romanian Communist Party or the Hungarian Communist Party, but he wanted to be his own man. He wanted to sort of start making bold moves within the region that would possibly diminish Stalin's absolute control. And Stalin didn't want these things to be happening. He wanted, it's not like the Marshall Plan, where the US government said, okay, we'll give you this money, but you've got to form relations, between yourselves. You've got to build up multilateralism. You've got to build up political and economic ties. This is how we want the Marshall Plan to sort of be achieved. Stalin wanted things very differently. He only wanted, bilateral agreements one way between the Soviet Union and the satellite states. He didn't want them to start merging one with the other. He didn't want them to start sort of creating separate power bases. This is precisely what Tito was doing. Now, Tito didn't know, how much trouble he was causing. As I said, he was a loyal Stalinist, and he was horrified by the responses that now came from Moscow. A series of extremely angry letters were exchanged between 1947 and 1948, between Tito and between Stalin, between the Soviet Communist Party and between the Yugoslav Communist Party. Very menacing letters, very minatory letters on the part of the Soviet Union, threatening to expel the Yugoslavs from the bloc. Threatening extreme sort of punishment if they were to carry on this course of sort of maverick politics. But essentially these letters from the Soviet Union were calling for the overthrow of Tito, for the healthy elements, that is the elements that were still with Stalin, to rise up, to depose of Tito, to kill him, to do whatever, and bring Yugoslavia back on track, to sort of diminish the state, to bring it into line, to transform it into once again a loyal satellite of the communist bloc, of the Soviet bloc. Now, there's a very good, if we turn to slide number 15, the great account of this story of the break between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia was delivered to us by a Montenegrin communist, so a member of the Yugoslav Communist Party, a man called Milovan Djilas. He wrote a short book which is still in print, so you can still find this even on Kindle edition. It's a Penguin classic called Conversations with Stalin. And in this, he depicts a series of meetings that he had as a delegate of the Yugoslav Party in Moscow with Stalin from 1947 till 1948. I think there are 3 meetings in total. He describes Stalin, he describes Molotov, he describes Beria, he describes Khrushchev, who was then at that stage a slightly more minor figure. He describes the highest echelons of the Communist Party, and he does so in an extremely vivid and extremely captivating way. But he also tells the story of this breakdown in Yugoslav Soviet relations. And the final meeting in which Stalin actually summoned Tito to Yugoslavia, but Tito quite sensibly refused to go. Of course, he would never have returned from that meeting, but sent Djilas instead. Djilas being more disposable, is quite an extraordinary account. He's there with Dimitrov, and he describes how Stalin simply is screaming at them, banging the table, saying, "You had no right. You never told me you were meeting at Bled, that you were signing these treaties between one another. We were not consulted. You wanted to sort of shine with originality." He says all of these things. And Djilas says that he kind of looks over at one point at Dimitrov, and says that he simply sees a man who is completely sort of defeated, completely cowed, red, pale-faced with red blotches, looking down at the ground. He seems to be shrinking inch by inch every time Stalin issues another sort of insult, or issues another issues another complaint against him. And Djilas was saying that this is incredible. It was only 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that Dimitrov, this was the man who at Leipzig, completely destroyed Goering's arguments, was our great hero, stood up to the entire Nazi criminal regime, and now he's been reduced to this tiny figure, as if this was a different person. He was really sort of mortified by what was happening. So the country's broke. Yugoslavia was expelled from the communist bloc in 1948, June 1948, to be precise, June the 28th, 1948, which would be exactly 30 years to the day since Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand, and Stalin certainly chose this date deliberately to make sure that the historical resonance was felt within Yugoslavia. Now, Stalin believed certainly that this would be the end of Yugoslavia. He said that he would only have to raise his little finger and Tito would be gone. that he could, he was so powerful, he could dispose of Tito quite easily, replace him with a loyal Stalinist, and Yugoslavia would be back in the bloc, just like the rest of the Eastern European states. In fact, it never happened. Didn't happen under Stalin. Did not happen under Khrushchev, despite strenuous efforts. Did not happen under Khrushchev. Did not happen under Brezhnev in the 1960s and the 1970s. Yugoslavia remained a communist state, but would now be on its own. This is slide number 16. It would be outside of the bloc. It would be going in a separate path. Now, there are very many consequences, but I've already spoken too much. So when we come back to Yugoslavia, I'll tell you in a few weeks' time, I'll tell you about some of the changes that took place within the Yugoslav communist state in order to sort of create its own brand of communism, to find its own place on the international stage. Tito, a very agile and a very canny and a very clever political figure, was able to survive this break just as he had survived many other close calls in previous years, and was able to sort of go out on his own, become his own man. For Stalin's part, he used this break as an excuse to round up any independent-minded communists in the rest of the bloc. He invented a new crime, the crime of Titoism. This referred to anyone who he, in his paranoia, feared might break away from the bloc, might go the same way as Tito, rounded them up, executed them, subjected them to show trials, and eventually by the early 1950s was able to achieve a very loyal set of communist leaders everywhere outside of Yugoslavia. Okay, I think we'll end it there because I've spoken far too long in this session. Thanks.